The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, "War is the father and king of all things." That's a chilling line, even by today's standards. If you had to name the single most destructive tragedy in human history, most people would point to war. And yet, paradoxically, some of humanity's greatest innovations were also born out of war. Even as millions were dying, someone was in a trench, a factory, or a lab, building something that would change the world. Why does humanity get more creative during war than during peace? Today, we're breaking down 6 reasons war accelerates human innovation, along with the everyday objects each one left behind. In peacetime, most inventions start with a simple goal: make life a little more convenient. That means there's room for compromise and for delay. Whether something ships tomorrow or takes a few more years rarely matters. The battlefield is a different story. Being a little too slow, a little too heavy, or a little too inconvenient can cost you your life or your country. There's no time to wait. War pushes people to their absolute limit, and that pressure forges new solutions. The wristwatch is a perfect example. Before World War I, the wristwatch was considered women's jewelry, while men carried pocket watches instead. A gentleman wearing a watch on his wrist would have actually been seen as a bit embarrassing. But in the trenches, the few seconds it took to pull a watch out of your pocket could get you killed. Trench warfare in particular required multiple units to time their assaults down to the second while dodging enemy shelling. Officers were the first to strap wire loops onto their pocket watches and wear them on their wrists, then added glow-in-the-dark dials for night operations and reinforced glass to protect against shrapnel. Because they were born in the trenches, people started calling them trench watches. After the war, returning veterans swapped the wire straps for leather bands, and the modern wristwatch as we know it was born. The trench coat came out of those same trenches. The mud and the bitter winter rain inside them were enemies of their own. Soldiers regularly froze to death from hypothermia caused by wet clothing. Surviving those brutal conditions required a coat that was easy to move in, waterproof, and lightweight. That's how British companies like Burberry came to create the trench coat, using specially treated waterproof fabric. Even the D-rings on the shoulder straps and waist belt, now a global fashion staple, were originally military hardware for hanging maps or a sidearm. The zipper tells a similar story. Before World War I, zippers jammed constantly and were basically unreliable prototypes. War changed all of that. On the front lines, even the speed of getting dressed was a matter of life and death. Fumbling with buttons one by one wasted precious time when the enemy was closing in, and buttons were just as much of an obstacle for pilots who needed to scramble into their flight suits in seconds. The zipper solved that problem in one stroke, and its durability improved dramatically in the process. After the war, millions of veterans who'd relied on that convenience in combat helped turn the zipper into a staple of everyday clothing, shoes, and bags. Sunglasses were also survival gear. For fighter pilots, harsh sunlight and glare weren't just an annoyance, they were a matter of life and death. As planes started flying above the clouds, pilots faced a real risk of temporary blindness that could send them into a fatal spiral. That's why the U.S. Army Air Corps developed a special green-tinted lens to cut the glare, marking the beginning of the modern sunglass. Throughout World War II, pilots across the Pacific and European theaters wore them, catching the public's attention. Once the war ended, Hollywood stars adopted that same tough, battle-ready look as a fashion statement, and sunglasses quickly became a beloved accessory worldwide. And then there's the thermos. It was actually commercialized in Germany back in 1903, but it didn't become a worldwide staple until after the World Wars. Inside a bomber flying in temperatures as low as -40 degrees, which happens to be -40 on both the Fahrenheit and Celsius scales, a hot cup of coffee or tea was essentially survival equipment against hypothermia. Once the war ended, this piece of military gear became a fixture in American homes almost overnight. In peacetime, developing even a single new technology is an uphill battle. You need to win research grants, convince investors, and if it fails, absorb the loss yourself. So, companies tend to bet only on research that already looks likely to succeed. War flips that equation entirely. When a nation's survival is on the line, there's no room to pinch pennies. Even long shot research gets funded from day one, and manpower and resources pour in without hesitation. Projects that would have been buried under budget constraints or red tape in peacetime suddenly become national priorities overnight. When the usual guardrails around capital, science, and regulation come off, the battlefield becomes the ultimate laboratory for testing how far humanity can actually go. The microwave oven is the textbook example. During World War II, the Allies poured enormous resources into improving radar technology to counter the German Luftwaffe. The research budget reportedly hit around $1.5 billion, with a workforce comparable in scale to the Manhattan Project that built the atomic bomb, a level of investment that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Britain and the United States focused intensely on the magnetron, a powerful device for generating microwaves. In the middle of that research, a chocolate bar melted in a researcher's pocket in a strange, unexplained way. That's how humanity discovered that radio waves could heat food. The internet followed the same pattern. The U.S. Department of Defense wanted a communications network that could survive a nuclear strike without going dark. Instead of relying on a single central server, engineers came up with the idea of a distributed network that broke information into pieces and sent it through multiple paths at once. It was an inefficient approach that the peacetime telecom industry would never have adopted on its own. But an anxious U.S. government threw astronomical sums of money and the era's best scientists at the problem. Bureaucratic hurdles and red tape were largely swept aside, and out of that came ARPANET, the network that would eventually become the root of the internet. GPS was also a project the United States built strictly for military purposes at enormous expense. Staying ahead of the Soviet Union meant tracking the exact position of every fighter jet, warship, and missile across every ocean and every sky on Earth without a single margin of error. To make that happen, the U.S. spent a massive amount of money launching dozens of military satellites into orbit. Commercially, it made zero financial sense. But when a nation is desperate to secure military dominance, cost and profitability simply don't factor into the equation. For a long time, these technologies stayed locked away as military secrets out of fear they'd fall into enemy hands and become weapons. But as wars ended and the Cold War thawed, military technology gradually made its way into civilian life one piece at a time. Humanity began repurposing tools built for war into tools for peace. The same three examples we just covered, the microwave, the internet, and GPS, are the best illustrations of this shift. This time, instead of asking how they were invented, let's look at how they actually became part of everyday life. Take the microwave first. Once the war ended, defense contractors needed a new market to profit from their radar expertise. That's when they turned back to the very radio waves that had melted that chocolate bar. An American company called Raytheon started developing the technology into a consumer cooking appliance, naming it the Radar Range after its radar origins. The first units were the size of a refrigerator and cost as much as a car. But as the technology improved and prices dropped, it eventually became a must-have appliance in nearly every American kitchen. The internet also broke free of its military origins and made its way out into the world. At first, it was a closed network used only by a handful of universities and research labs backed by the Department of Defense, something the average person didn't even know existed. Then, in the early 1990s, the arrival of the World Wide Web, something anyone could navigate with a simple click, sent it exploding into the mainstream. What began as a clunky, classified communications network transformed within half a century into a commercial infrastructure connecting all of humanity. GPS is an even more dramatic story. It was originally a military only system with no civilian access at all. Then, in 1983, tragedy struck. A Korean Air passenger flight traveling from New York to Seoul drifted off course, entered Soviet airspace, and was shot down. If that plane had been equipped with precise satellite positioning, the disaster could have been avoided entirely. In the wake of that tragedy, President Ronald Reagan ordered GPS to be opened up for civilian use, though the accuracy was deliberately degraded out of concern that adversaries might exploit it for missile guidance. Pressure to sharpen civilian GPS accuracy kept building, and in 2000, that restriction was finally lifted altogether. An error margin that once exceeded 100 meters, or roughly 330 feet, eventually shrank down to just a few meters, around 10 feet. Everything we rely on today, from GPS navigation and smartphone maps to package tracking, drones, and self-driving cars, exists because GPS was fully opened up at that moment. War gives nations a monopoly over certain resources: steel, rubber, leather, even cooking oil. Anything needed to manufacture weapons and supplies gets seized as top priority. But life on the home front can't simply stop. Rather than give up the things they're missing, people start hunting for other materials that can do the same job. War is what pushes substitute technologies forward. This process gave rise to substitutes nobody saw coming, and in some cases, after the war ended, those substitutes actually pushed the original product aside and became the new mainstream. The bra is a perfect example. Before World War I, women's undergarments meant the corset, a rigid garment reinforced with metal boning that cinched the waist and shaped the chest and torso. It looked elegant, but it made moving freely almost impossible. War changed everything. As men left for the front, women stepped into their jobs on factory floors, and some even served as nurses on the battlefield. Women started demanding underwear they could actually move in. On top of that came the finishing blow: resource scarcity. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, the government asked women to cut back on buying corsets so that the metal inside them could be redirected to the war effort. The steel that saved amounted to roughly 28,000 tons, enough to build 2 battleships. Women happily ditched their corsets, and lightweight fabric alternatives took their place. That's the bra women all over the world wear today. Wartime material shortages, combined with women entering the workforce, ended up rewriting the entire history of women's fashion. Nylon stockings are another product of wartime scarcity. Nylon stockings actually hit the market just before World War II, in 1939, courtesy of the American chemical company DuPont. They were more durable and thinner than the silk stockings women had worn up to that point, and they became an instant sensation. But that happiness didn't last. Once World War II broke out, every ounce of nylon was redirected toward making parachutes and tires, and stockings vanished from store shelves overnight. It was only after the war ended could factories start producing them again, and when they did, women lined up in droves outside department stores across the country in a genuine shopping frenzy. Fanta is the most unexpected drink to come out of war. When World War II broke out, Coca-Cola's German bottling plant lost access to the syrup shipped from its American headquarters. But the plant couldn't just shut its doors. The German branch improvised, mixing together leftover apple pulp and whey, whatever ingredients were available domestically, to create a brand new drink. The problem was nobody had a name for it. Management told employees to get creative, and a salesman, hearing the German word fantasy, meaning imagination, suggested shortening it to Fanta. That's how a drink that's now as woven into daily life as Coca-Cola itself came to be. Margarine was invented as a substitute for butter. In 19th century France, butter was expensive and the supply was unreliable. Napoleon III offered a cash prize to anyone who could invent an affordable butter substitute that soldiers and working-class families could afford, essentially a government-sponsored R&D challenge, not unlike the Pentagon's DARPA challenge today. A French chemist answered the call by mixing beef tallow with milk to create margarine. Through 2 subsequent world wars, margarine cemented itself as a reliable staple on dinner tables around the world. War is a massive logistics operation that has to supply millions of soldiers simultaneously, and that process forces standardization and mass production into existence. Standardization work that would normally take decades in peacetime gets completed in just a few years under the pressure of war. And once the war ends, those standards become the baseline for entire global industries. It all started with the canned food. In the early 19th century, Napoleon launched a contest to find a way to keep food from spoiling in order to solve his army's supply problems. A confectioner came up with the idea of sealing food inside glass jars. That idea crossed over to Britain and evolved into the tin can we know today. Across both world wars, can sizes and sealing methods became standardized worldwide, and once the fighting stopped, that standard spread to the entire civilian food industry, dramatically extending how long food could stay fresh. Spam is the best battlefield ration to come out of World War II. This canned meat, made by the American company Hormel, was shipped out in the hundreds of millions of cans, not just to U.S. troops, but across the entire Allied coalition, including Britain and the Soviet Union. Carried to Hawaii in bulk by American troops stationed across the Pacific, Spam wove itself deeply into the local food culture long after the fighting stopped. Spam musubi, the snack you'll still find in every corner store in Hawaii today, is a direct descendant of that wartime supply chain. Instant coffee also spread like wildfire thanks to the war. It could be brewed anywhere with nothing but hot water, it kept for a long time, and its caffeine kick was genuinely useful for troops on active duty. Countless soldiers tried instant coffee for the first time on the battlefield, and once the war ended, the habit stuck with them. These technologies, mass-produced and distributed to keep armies of millions alive, ended up transforming how the entire human race eats and became the new baseline for modern food culture. In war, disease kills more soldiers than bullets do. When tens of thousands of troops live in close quarters, even a minor infection can rip through an entire army in no time. That's why militaries have always advanced sanitation, disease prevention, and trauma care faster than anyone else. No army can win a war without solving that problem first, and that's exactly why war pushes medical and hygiene technology to its absolute limits. The technologies born from that pressure went on after the fighting ended to become the foundation of our everyday health and hygiene. Let's start with the sanitary pad. During World War I, the American paper company Kimberly-Clark faced a cotton shortage and developed Cellucotton, an artificial cotton made from wood fiber. This material absorbed 5 times more than natural cotton and was much cheaper to produce. It was used on the battlefield in massive quantities as bandaging to stop soldiers bleeding. Field nurses noticed its remarkable absorbency and started repurposing it as makeshift sanitary pads. After the war, the company commercialized that idea and released Kotex, the first disposable sanitary pad ever sold. A battlefield bandage material ended up sparking a hygiene revolution that dramatically improved women's quality of life. Facial tissue traces back to that same root. Once the war ended, Kimberly-Clark was left sitting on a massive surplus of cellulose. The company processed the soft material into thin paper sheets and marketed it as a way to remove cold cream after applying makeup. That's how Kleenex got its start. Sunscreen, that essential of every summer, was also born under the blazing sun of war. On the Pacific Front, intense ultraviolet exposure caused serious skin burns among American troops. To combat this, the military developed a UV-blocking ointment for soldiers. As the formula and texture improved over the years, it evolved into today's sunscreen industry. Aerosol spray was also a product of war. During World War II, American troops had to fight off malaria and yellow fever carrying mosquitoes as much as they fought the enemy. At one point, more soldiers were being taken out by mosquito bites than by actual combat. To fight back, the military developed a portable spray that made it easy to apply insecticide. After the war, that same technology spread beyond pesticides into air fresheners, hairspray, and a whole range of everyday household products. Even right now, wars are still being fought all over the world. The war between the US and Iran, the war between Russia and Ukraine, they'll all leave something behind for humanity down the road. Technology itself is neither good nor evil. It's only the reason it was born that's tragic. The fact that humanity only takes its next step forward in innovation after paying the price in countless lives lost and untold destruction, that's the cruelest contradiction history keeps showing us over and over again.